So, starting an Instagram Live. I'll wait a few minutes before people to show up, but I hope everybody is doing okay. If you have a chance, I don't know if it's possible to comment on these lives actually, but where are people logging in from? I'm curious where people are logging in from, and how are you doing? What are you doing today? Hey there, as I'm asking people, where are they logging in from? What country are you from? What city are you from? How are you guys doing? Hey there. San Francisco, okay, from Madrid. How are things going in Madrid? There's a total lockdown. When was the last time you left your apartment? Hey, Evan. Long Island, living the dream. New York City, I'm in New York City as well. New York City has kind of, to its credit, has kind of emptied out. Like, I think people are allowed to walk around, which is fine, but New York City is pretty empty. Times Square is a ghost town. And so someone took a dog for a walk in Dallas. A lot of people, here's an interesting thing. I don't want to say it's funny, although when I first heard it was funny. A lot of people in New York City, a lot of wealthy people, for instance, left New York City. They were like, oh, I'm going to leave New York City. New York City is going to be dangerous. And they went to the Hamptons. Well, if you know anything about the Hamptons, there's only one thin road that goes out to the Hamptons, and there's not really any hospitals there. And so all these people who went from New York City to the Hamptons, they brought the coronavirus with them. So all these people in the Hamptons are getting coronavirus, and they can't get out of the Hamptons. They're stuck because there's only one lane. There's only a one-lane road that gets you out of the Hamptons. They can't get to the hospitals. So it was sort of stupid for all these like wealthy people to go from New York City to the Hamptons. But this someone says that's actually a nice story. It's kind of funny. This virus has kind of brought out the insanity in people. There's is the bottom over? I don't know, but I'll address that in a second. Oh, thanks so much. Batman Scoop and I shouted out your show on OPP. I'd love to, we should go on each other's podcast. Poetic Justice? I don't know if it's poetic justice about that Hampton story as much as just people who are smart in one area always think they're smart in another area. So maybe somebody was a lawyer or a banker, or made a lot of money, bought a house in the Hamptons, and they think, well, I'm smart, and I think New York City is going to be a disaster. And so they left for the Hamptons. They brought the coronavirus with them. And again, if you don't know about the geography of the Hamptons, you can't get out of the Hamptons. There's only a one-lane road. So if everyone's going there, you can't really get out. And there's no hospitals there. So all these people are like trapped with symptoms in the Hamptons, and they were just stupid. All these people who thought they were the smartest people of all. So let me answer this question. Why am I more optimistic than David Sinclair? His take is very pessimistic. So David Sinclair is a super smart guy. He wrote a book called Lifespan, which is a book about anti-aging, and he's a researcher at Harvard. And he came on the podcast, and he seemed pessimistic. But if you listen to the podcast carefully, I kind of questioned him on several things, and he admitted they were all true. There's lots of ways that, of course, the worst case scenario is the worst case scenario. But there are many, many ways for there to be a better case scenario. For instance, let's look at a couple ways in which this coronavirus could end sooner rather than later. I'm not optimistic and I'm not pessimistic. By the way, in January, when I saw the first factories closing in China, I called everyone I knew who were dependent on factories keep staying open in China, and I said, stock up on inventories now. And some of them did, and some of them didn't, and the ones who didn't are kind of sad that they didn't. So I haven't been always optimistic, but I am more optimistic than the worst case scenarios. But even David Sinclair, when we were talking on the podcast, we talked about possible ways this could end earlier. One example is this virus is mutating every single day. Don't forget, imagine how a virus gets contagious. A virus is incredibly contagious if it doesn't kill people, for instance, because then it lasts longer inside the human body. If you're dead, you can't spread the virus. So the virus doesn't really want its host to die. The virus wants to spread. So in Darwinistic theory, any virus mutates to become weaker so that it stays longer in its human host and then is more contagious. So what we're starting to see, and this is a possibility, I'm not saying it's definite, but one thing we can see is we do know the virus is mutating. We do know that there's a good chance it can mutate to be weaker, just like SARS and other viruses did, and then it just goes away. Once it's weak enough, it goes away. The first population that the virus tends to hurt are the elderly, and they die fairly quickly, so they're not contagious after they die. And so the virus becomes more and more asymptomatic, and then that's how it lives the longest. That's survival of the fittest. That's why the virus mutates. That's why all viruses, that's why the flu mutates. Now, sometimes it'll mutate negatively, but most of the time it will mutate positively. Another way this virus might end sooner rather than later is where we're seeing drugs. You know, in France, there was a study, I don't know how to say the word, hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. There was this study that 100% of the people in this study were cured as opposed to only 10% when they used this drug. Now, there was this story yesterday, and there was all these headlines. By the way, fuck the headlines. There were all these headlines yesterday. Man dies taking chloroquine to cure coronavirus. That was an inaccurate headline and inaccurate news. He was taking chloroquine phosphate, a different drug. It's a drug that's used to, clean fish tanks, and he took it. So, okay, it's not the result of the study because there's no actual scientific result. That's why the FDA wants to do further trials. But all the evidence, there's many studies happening right now. I think it's University of Washington. There are many schools that are starting to continue these studies on hydroxychloroquine, also studies on chloroquine. I've talked to people who are heavily involved in curing malaria in Africa, from government officials to doctors. Second study is less clear. 87% got better. 93% in placebo control got better. Still, that's not the evidence that's coming out of Africa on chloroquine. It's not coming out of all the anecdotal evidence. And it's true. There's no FDA study. My feeling is, we know that with doctor supervised results or with doctor supervised prescriptions, that chloroquine has safe doses, and there's no reason not to see if an orphan use for chloroquine is to either slow down the onset of symptoms or to prevent. So another way that this pandemic could end sooner rather than later is simply due to the timeline that it seems to exist in countries is not forever. So people keep saying to me, oh, if this exponentially grows like it's growing, then there could be tens of millions of deaths. And if you look at it, there's not one single country where this virus grew exponentially more than 3 or 4 or 5 doubles. People act like exponential math in a vacuum. If something doubles 10 times, 1 turns into a million. If a million doubles 10 times after that, it turns into, a trillion. So we don't even have a trillion people on the planet, and there's a lot of reasons why what's called in a closed group, that things do not exponentially double forever. Usually they double, in every country that I've looked at so far, all the data, usually they double 3 or 4 times, maybe 5 times, depending on how you're counting it. But this is not a virus that exponentially grows forever. It will grow, and then eventually there's a combination of herd immunity, other people are immune, the most susceptible to pass it on and to acquire it are all either dead or isolated. So exponential growth tends to slow down, and you can't, the math is not terrifying because nothing in a bounded group grows exponentially forever. It's not like we have, there's not going to be 150 million cases in the United States, for instance. There's not, I saw a worst case scenario of 14 million deaths. China had a reported 3,500 deaths. And even if China was totally lying, multiply it by 30, they had 100,000 deaths, let's just say. There's 1.3 billion people in China. 100,000 deaths were 4 times fewer people. And we have a better healthcare system. We have less smokers in our system, less people with predisposition to it. There's less pollution here. So there's no reason to think we're going to be worse than China. Okay, so someone asked a really great question. What happens if we stop isolating and the virus comes again? By the way, we're going to stop isolating at some point, and the virus is going to come again. So all these pandemics, or most of these pandemics, have a second wave. The Spanish flu had a second wave and a third wave. The Asian flu of 1957 had a very devastating second wave. The Hong Kong flu in 1968 had a second wave. SARS, H1N1, every one of these things has a second wave. Now, someone's saying China stopped the spread more efficiently than we have. I think that's unclear. It's not so clear to me. Here's one way we know that the virus will end completely in 4 weeks. Here's one thing we can do. If we all locked ourselves in a closet, then the virus will have no way to pass on or to live, and within 4 weeks, it will be dead. If everybody in the world just sat in a closet for 4 weeks and spoke to nobody and touched nobody and nothing, this virus will die in 4 weeks. Now, we obviously can't do that. We're doing this social distancing. Even in countries with lockdown, they still have to get food. They still have to, in many countries you were able to, in the United States, for instance, we're doing all this lockdowns and social distancing, but people are walking around the block. People are walking their dogs. People are going to the grocery store and delivering food. So, and there's essential jobs where people are going to work. There's no such thing as 100% quarantine and lockdown. I'm not sure social distancing even works. If you look at South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, not a single business closed because of coronavirus, and South Korea had 94 deaths. Singapore had 2 deaths. I'm not really sure about Hong Kong and Taiwan and Japan, but none of these countries closed businesses. So I'm not so sure doing extreme social distancing where you shut down the economy works. Here's what we know works. We know that hand washing works. That is the only thing. Wash your hands 5 times a day. That is the only thing we know for sure works. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. And also what we know is that the virus tends to fade away. It happened in China. It happened in South Korea. It happened in Singapore. It maybe is starting to happen in Italy. Italy, by the way, we just saw for 2 days in a row a decline in deaths. And it looks like the third day there might be a decline in new deaths. And we'll have to, that 2 days doesn't make a trend. We'll have to keep an eye on that, but that's certainly extremely good news. Italy is about 10 days ahead of us, so maybe we can hope for similar data in 10 days or less. Why less? So people compare us to Italy, that we could be just like Italy. Well, a couple of things. One is Italy has an older population than the U.S. 2, Italy has more smokers than the U.S. Italy has higher pollution than the U.S. There's no reason to think that our timeline will be the same as Italy. So if we're 10 days behind Italy and Italy is starting to see good data now, then perhaps so Italy's been in a lockdown. That's true. So that's the only reason why we might be similar to Italy. But other than that, their cases have been heavily weighted towards the elderly. We have much fewer elderly in the United States getting it, perhaps because the elderly are self-isolating more in the U.S. The New York numbers do look like Italy in the beginning, but again, we're 10 days behind Italy, so we'll see. We've been doing more and more restrictive lockdowns. I think people are starting to realize in this past week how serious this is. So I think I went outside in New York a week ago. There were much more people on the street than there are right now. So it's not like all the news is good, but I want to also say, let's just talk about the warning signs when people start talking. When they say, there's exponential growth, and then if it keeps doubling, it's going to be 100 million or 10 million deaths. There's no such thing as exponential growth in a bounded community. We're bounded by population, we're bounded by immunity, we're bounded by the various weaknesses in the virus as it mutates. So there's lots of things preventing this from having constant exponential growth. The other thing people say is, if I say the number of new deaths is going down, people sometimes respond, oh no, there's more deaths than ever today. Let me just say, that is the stupidest thing you could possibly say. Of course, there are more deaths today than yesterday. People don't recover from death. The number of deaths only goes up in history. So you can't ever say there's more deaths yesterday today than yesterday. Deaths are surging. Of course, people can't come back from the dead. The number of deaths are only going to get worse. But what the data that's important to look at is number of new deaths per day. And is that percentage going down? Like, was it 50% one day, then 30%, then negative 10%? These are the important numbers. By the way, someone says 50% of the U.S. will get it. Let's not forget, in H1N1, the WHO was, the World Health Organization was saying, oh my God, half the world's going to get this. Tens of millions of people will die. Their estimates were so off. It's hard to even find now. It's hard to even Google how off they were because there's so many they put out so many reports of the actual number of deaths that happened, which was like a fraction of what they predicted. So, don't listen to all the worst case scenarios. People seem to be attached to their worst case scenarios because, of course, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Here is, okay. So question is, let's just talk about the stock market for a second. Stimulus is going to be great, but, hopefully it's going to be bipartisan. Someone asked me about what the best case scenario is. Let me talk about the market for a second first. I haven't seen what the final stimulus is. I've seen bits and pieces. We also know what the federal stimulus is. It's a lot of stuff that's technical and it's in the weeds. But let me just say this. My guess is there's going to be about $6 trillion of stimulus happening right now. And most of that stimulus you'll start to see in the economy in about 6 months. There's, hundreds of billions you'll start to see very short term. For instance, if people get checks and so on. The stimulus is going to be very good for the stock market and is going to be somewhat good. And it's going to be very good in the long term for the economy. But no economy gets wealthy from government stimulus. And I'm not being capitalist or conservative or libertarian here. It's just no economy in history gets rich off of a government getting more and more in debt. As the government can't just write checks for everybody instead of businesses. You have to grow business. You can't shut down an economy. An economy, you can't just shut it down like it's a light. There's no light switch. Oh, let's turn off the economy, and then 3 months later, let's turn it on again. The economy is society. It's not like there's Wall Street and Main Street and they're disconnected. Wall Street and Main Street are the same thing. Wall Street funds Main Street. Main Street makes Wall Street survive so that Wall Street has something to fund. They're connected. So the economy is how a society grows and thrives. You cannot shut down the economy forever. And so here's what's going to happen. Whether it's good or bad, whether it's too soon or too late, they're going to stop the restrictions on businesses. They're going to stop the restrictions on businesses being closed. I don't know if it's going to happen in a week, but certainly within 2 weeks, it's going. I would say it's going to happen, or could happen, because what if the economy was to be shut down for, let's say, another month from now? You're talking about a 30 or 40% decrease in the nation's GDP, or a 30 or 40% contraction of the economy. That's never happened before. That's someone's asked, is opening the economy worth people dying? I'll answer that in a second. You can't risk 30 or 40% of the economy shutting down or contracting. And the reason is that you'll have something like 30 to 40 million extra unemployed people. Okay, you'll have an employment rate of 30 or 40%. What happens then? Well, let's look at what happened in the Great Depression. 23 out of 100,000 people started killing themselves. Right now, the number of people per 100,000 people who kill themselves is at 13. So you're going to have more deaths from suicides, from homicides. You're going to have people struggling with illnesses they can no longer afford to have. You're going to have you're going to have a different society. And so when you say, can we risk more coronavirus deaths, or do we risk keeping the economy closed for months? you kind of have to do both. We've already risked the economy in order to try to slow down coronavirus. We don't know yet if that's worked, but you can't risk the economy forever, or many more people will die or suffer from a permanent economic shutdown than will suffer from coronavirus. So whether or not I'm correct doesn't even matter. This is how the U.S. government thinks right now. They're going to open up the economy. Well, again, whether it's a week or 2 weeks, I don't know. Here's my guess. They're going to have restrictions on elderly. They might say, hey, people under 40 come out first. They're still going to have restrictions on large gatherings. They still might have some restrictions state by state or in hot spots, like New York City is a hot spot. But they're going to reopen the economy, and that's the most important thing. Doesn't matter how much federal stimulus you do. If you don't reopen the economy, the stimulus will do nothing to make the overall economy. You can't keep an economy together with Band-Aids and Scotch tape. You have to actually reopen the economy for the economy to get better. And so the other thing is that the stimulus, though, will have, by the way, I just saw some news. According to an Oxford study, fewer than 1 in 1,000 people who develop the virus will have symptoms. Who knows if that's true or not, but that's coming out of Oxford just a few minutes ago. Someone saying they don't think Governor Newsom in California is going to reopen early. That may or may not be true, and then it might be the case that California has no economy left and other states do. So that's what happens. You can't shut down an economy and then open it up. The average restaurant in the United States has 16 days of cash left. So if you close the economy for another week, something like millions of restaurants and 10 million people will become unemployed. You cannot, even in the Great Depression, the worst month ever for unemployment was the worst week ever for unemployment was about 700,000 layoffs. This week alone, we're going to have about 1.5 million people apply for unemployment insurance. That is not a functioning economy that can continue. Our whole system our whole way of life will change if you keep the economy closed. And that is a certainty. Here's what's really uncertain. What's uncertain is we don't know if the worst case scenario is going to happen with coronavirus, but probably it won't. It hasn't happened in any country ever. And it's much more likely for a middle case or best case scenario to happen. So we don't know what will happen with coronavirus, but it's probably not as bad as people predict, as usual. And we do know what will happen if the economy stays shut down. So the U.S. government has to open up the economy at some point. And, or it's just millions and millions of people will suffer. 7 billion people around the planet will suffer, as opposed to how many people will suffer from coronavirus. And so hopefully they'll pass some this reminds me of the TARP bill in 2008. At first they didn't pass it, and then they passed it, and the market went up huge. And then the market dipped again, and then the market bottomed in March of 2009, and then it went up huge again. And then, by the way, then we had H1N1, the swine flu. The WHO was predicting, hundreds of millions of cases around the world. There was a fraction of that. There was so many more deaths. The White House was predicting up to 90,000 deaths in 2009 in the U.S. There was 12,000 deaths in the U.S., a fraction. So yes, this situation is kind of incomparable to any other in the past. But is it? I don't know. It's a virus. It works like any other virus. Viruses have a beginning, a middle, and an end. No virus lasts forever. No virus in history has ever lasted forever. Viruses mutate. Viruses become weaker. There become cures. There's already suggestions that a lot of cures are potentially working. So we'll study this appropriately. 6 out of 7 people that have the virus have 0 symptoms. I've actually heard that percentage is much greater, but we won't. Here's the thing. We're not going to know until afterwards how many people truly got the virus. We won't know until a year from now, when there's full 100% testing, how many people get sick and have no symptoms. So do I see stocks up or down in the near term? So it just depends. We've got to open up. Here are the things to focus on. Focus on new deaths per day. Don't focus on number of deaths. Don't focus on number of cases. So many people, I saw all these headlines this morning. Number of cases surging, blah, blah, blah. Duh, of course they're surging. We have new tests. We're testing more people. It would not make sense if the number of cases weren't surging. They're surging because we have more tests now. So that headline is just an idiot headline. Second, focus on the number of deaths per day, and in the economy, focus on the stimulus. And I agree, we don't want to have a stimulus package that just bails out the casinos, the cruise lines, and the airlines. That would be a stupid stimulus bill. But there are many more things happening in this stimulus that I've seen that are going to help individual people. There's going to be loans available to small businesses. There's going to be a potential for a UBI, a universal basic income, which I was in favor of with when Yang was running, and I'm in favor of now. I think it's a great idea, and it's actually going to be bigger than what Yang was proposing. And so look for the federal stimulus to get passed, and look specifically what's in the federal stimulus. Finally, look for the economy to reopen. So if you're concerned about the stock market, you need the economy to reopen. Even if we contain coronavirus 100%, if the economy doesn't reopen for 3 months, then you can just kiss capitalism and the U.S. way of life out the window. There won't be any capitalism anymore if we have a 3-month shutdown. That is just over. So my guess is the economy will reopen by within the next, if not next week, then by the end of next week. Hopefully even by the end of this week, but I doubt it. I think they want to pass the stimulus bill first, make sure that they don't risk that. So they'll pass the stimulus bill, and then they'll start planning. Now, how will they reopen the economy? Certainly, people who test positively are going to be quarantined. There's going to be more aggressive testing. There's going to be people who are elderly will be quarantined. There won't be any lift on large gatherings. That large gatherings will still remain closed until the data on coronavirus gets better. Maybe they will reopen the economy in stages. People under 40 can go to work. Then people under 50 can go to work. Then people under 60 can go to work. And we'll keep an accurate track of the data. Is there more deaths happening? Again, the data we care about are more people with symptoms per day and more deaths per day happening. That is the day. So someone says, have I seen footage of the hospitals in Italy? It's horrible. Yeah, I've seen the footage. It is horrible. This is a disaster. No one is denying that this is a disaster. And no country in the West has been prepared for this, for the carnage that has happened. But one photograph and deaths, that's a separate decision from reopening the economy. You want to see a disaster too? Look at pictures of the food lines during the Great Depression. Look at the number of suicides and how the suicide rate went up in the Depression. Look at World War II, which was an outcome in part of the Depression. So there's a lot more suffering that could occur if we're in a depression. And so people are asking, do I put mousse on my hair? No. The great thing about quarantine is that I don't have to look good or clean myself at all other than washing my hands, and you can't get a haircut or whatever. All the barbershops are closed. So, okay, question is, what's my best case scenario? My best case scenario is, and I'm going to talk about both the economy and the coronavirus. And again, this is based on all the discussions I've had with doctors. I don't have an opinion myself on the coronavirus. I'm just basing this on discussions with the people in the medical community who are experts. The best case scenario is that we see a peak between April 10th and April 20th, which means the number of new deaths per day starts to go down. And that's a best case scenario. And I kind of think that's a likely scenario, but we'll see. The other best case scenario is that the virus starts to mutate, so it's weaker. Another best case scenario is that as temperatures get warmer, we know this. The coronavirus likes to be transmitted in cold and dry weather. Doesn't mean it won't be transmitted in hot and humid weather, but there's less chance of transmission in hot and humid weather. And people say, well, look at Singapore. They had hot weather. Yeah, Singapore only had 2 deaths. And yes, they had a lot more testing, but who knows? It's a combination of factors. That's the reason why Singapore did so well. So as we move into warmer temperatures, there will be less transmission. Even for yourself, drink, and this is from David Sinclair, drink hot liquids during the day. The virus does not like hot temperatures. It does like cold and dry temperatures. It doesn't like hot and humid temperatures. So drink coffee or tea or whatever. Now, developing countries, I don't know how they're going to fare, but look, perhaps because there hasn't been a lot of testing, there hasn't been a lot of cases in Africa or India, but these are also warmer countries, so we'll see what happens. They're going to be interesting case studies. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in South Korea and even in China now that they're letting people back to work. We have to follow all of that data. So okay. By the way, someone mentions the baby boomers and the greatest generation. I kind of think we're the greatest generation now. Basically, everybody kind of surviving through this period. I mentioned the other day, this coronavirus is a worse situation even than World War II. And of course, in some ways it's not, and of course, in some ways it is. But think about this. This is the first time in history, in world history. So the human species has been around for, 250,000 years. It's the first time in the history of the human species that everybody on the planet is united around a single purpose. We should congratulate, or not congratulate, but we should be proud of ourselves that we are surviving this and that we are trying to figure this out, and that science is being, both private industry and public, is trying to figure this out. Already they're working on, there's like 19 different trials for vaccines. There are a ton of trials for new cures. There's the FDA the FDAs all around the world are fast tracking cures and vaccines. There's a lot of evidence that this is not exponentially growing as people suggest. There's a lot of reasons to think that this is going to be more close to the best case scenario than the worst case scenario. Also, the economy. Thank God the economy was doing well before this happened. Don't forget, before 9/11, we were in a recession. Before the financial crisis, we were in a recession. So it was harder to have financial stimulus. Now, we had an abundance of economic growth. So there's more opportunity to have even a greater stimulus without suffering the bad effects of stimulus. But one thing I've noticed, though, is that people tend to be the worst version of themselves during this coronavirus. And I see it more than usual on social media. People are insulting each other. People are yelling at each other. People are calling each other all sorts of names. People are fighting on the ground of Whole Foods for the last roll of toilet paper. And I think what's happening is, people always say with money, if you have more money, it tends to enhance whoever you are on the inside. It's the same thing with this coronavirus. What's happening is this fear, this isolation, this anxiety seems to be enhancing whoever we are on the inside. So if you were already the type of person to call someone names, you're even more like that right now. If you're the type of person who's going to fight on the floor of a grocery store over toilet paper, you're probably even more likely to do that now as you revert to this childlike version of yourself. But if you're the type of person who looks at information calmly, if you're the type of person that tries to encourage people and look at how we can solve things, and you can't just look at coronavirus in isolation. There's coronavirus, there's the economy. People are not getting their cancer treatments right now because hospitals are focusing so much on coronavirus. Dentist offices are closed, and it sounds kind of foolish, like who needs to clean their teeth right now? But people forget dental pain in the 1800s was the highest cause of suicide. If you need a root canal, I feel bad for you if your dentist office is closed. We need to reopen dental offices. There are other diseases. There are other illnesses. There are other ways people die on this planet. And coronavirus, even if it comes back in waves, will eventually develop many methods of dealing with coronavirus, ranging from social isolation to vaccines to cures. We don't have those in place right now. That's unfortunate. But again, let's look at the track record of the WHO, the World Health Organization. Every single time there's a new virus, they say this is a pandemic. They've always been wrong. They were wrong with SARS, avian flu, swine flu, and now they're more correct than they were before. But again, we're not seeing in China. We didn't see millions of deaths, and yes, they had a lockdown in Wuhan, but they didn't have a lockdown in Beijing and many other cities. They had partial lockdowns in many of these other cities, and China survived. And the disease, it got to the point where in all of China the other day there were 0 new deaths. So this pandemic again has a lifespan that's not. It doesn't last for a year or 6 months. It tends to last about 3 months, give or take. And if it lasts 3 months from the first case of 100 cases, then in the U.S. that would mean a peak is going to come around April 15th, and the peak will be numbered in the thousands of deaths per day, not in the hundreds of thousands like people think, because it doesn't exponentially grow as people are suggesting. Nobody can show me a single country where there was exponential growth beyond 5 doubles. So that's just ridiculous. Anybody who says there's going to be exponential growth for the next 6 months does not know how to use a calculator. So it's just not true. We're not the type of any community that is bounded in any way at all does not have exponential growth. You have a growth like this. It looks like a learning curve. Think about when you learn a new skill. It works exactly like how a learning curve works. Okay, at first you learn exponentially, but then you hit a limit. There's only so much I can learn basketball, because then eventually I'm going to hit a limit. I'm not going to be able to learn anymore. I'm just going to be limited by my own inability to learn basketball. So that's the same thing. That's a bounded environment. My brain is bounded, and I'm not going to be able to learn. The population of the U.S. is bounded. The number of people who lack immunity to this is bounded. So eventually, the number of people who are going to have symptoms is even more bounded. So eventually, exponential growth stops much sooner than people think. Okay, this is just a math problem. It's not even a medical problem. It's a math problem. And so coronavirus cannot be as bad as people are suggesting. And people are comparing it to the Spanish flu. Spanish flu was much different than this. So you just had a phone call. Yes, there's a law of diminishing returns. There's also something called the sigmoid curve. Look it up. It defines the math of how you deal with exponential growth in a bounded community. So someone's asking a great question. Can a second wave be worse than this first wave? And the answer is absolutely. If you look at, and this is why also it's important to study the history of these things. So I wrote a book 10 years ago. My worst book ever, Investing for the Apocalypse. Do not buy it. It's out of date. But chapter 2 in this book was pandemic. This has always been a concern of everyone. I wrote about this in 2011 when this book came out. This is the Wall Street Journal Guide to Investing for the Apocalypse by me. And so pandemics have always been a concern. But, we're right now, everything is acting in as it should. Yes, the U.S. was not prepared, but no Western country was prepared. Asia was prepared because of SARS and swine flu and avian flu. Because they eat bats in China, Asia was much better prepared for a pandemic than we were. So someone asked what's the name of that book? The Wall Street Journal Guide to Investing for the Apocalypse. I don't recommend it. I'm just pointing it out to say I've written about pandemics repeatedly. So someone's asking, should we come out of quarantine immediately? To be honest, I kind of think we need to wait a few days. We should wait for the stimulus, because I do think I'm seeing so many of my friends in the restaurant business. I own a bar in New York City. And so I'm seeing so many of my friends in the restaurant and bar business. They're unemployed, or the owners can't pay the rent, can't pay their employees. Everyone's going out of business. I would say 3/4 from anecdotally, from conversations, 3/4 of small to medium New York City restaurants and bars will go out of business, and probably many retail stores as well. That's not going to happen. So a short-term stimulus is going to help that. There's going to be plenty of opportunities for small business owners to take out loans or to get some sort of funding. But the government cannot support an economy. An economy supports the government. That's how capitalism works. The government is there to keep the wheels moving, and the entire purpose of government is to help those who cannot help themselves. So I don't take a libertarian view. I do think there's an important role for government, which is to help the people who can't help themselves. And there are many people in the United States who, for many reasons, cannot help themselves and need government help. But the role of government is not to support the entire economy. The government makes its money from the economy. Okay, how does the government make revenues? The government makes revenues from taxes. That's where the bulk of the revenues come from. And so you cannot shut down. If 30 million people go unemployed, what will happen? State governments will run out of money. By the way, state governments need money to build infrastructure projects. Bridges that are 60 years old need to get rebuilt, need to get fixed. Tunnels, schools, firemen, policemen, healthcare workers, all these people need to get paid. You can't just write a check to them. The government needs to raise money through either borrowing or taxation. And so in order to tax people, you need to open up, people need to work. People need to go to work. In order to borrow money, other countries need to trust that the U.S. can pay its debts. The U.S. can only pay its debts if the economy is growing and we're adding more revenues each year because of rising tax rates, or rising taxes rather. So for better or for worse, you cannot do you can do a 2-month shutdown in Italy, by the way, for the economy. You know why you can do a 2-month shutdown in Italy? Is because Italy kind of sucks. Like, they don't know how to, they've stopped working, and ever since the bailouts in the early 10s, countries like Italy and Greece have not had as many workers. They've had a more and more elderly population. They have less children every year. So you can't count on Italy to save its economy. The EU will probably be required to save the Italian economy. But you can't do the same thing in the U.S. The U.S. supports the rest of the world. So for better or for worse, unless you completely change our way of life and roll back the clock 200 years, you have to reopen the economy. And it can't happen in August. It can't happen in July. I don't think it could happen in June. I don't even think it could happen in May. I think if you wait till May, you're going to see probably 30 million layoffs, worse than the Great Depression, worse than anything we've ever encountered before. It'll be such a dramatic effect on the economy. States will collapse. Then eventually the U.S. government will collapse, because no country can survive a 30% contraction in their economy. Germany didn't survive it. That's why they started World War II. Zimbabwe didn't survive it. The Soviet Union didn't survive a collapse of their economy. That's how they got overthrown. So here's what I believe is going to happen, and what we should kind of focus on as a society. I do think the coronavirus is going to peak in the United States sometime in April. I've previously said April 15th, but who really knows? If you assume a 3-month lifespan for the coronavirus, it'll be around, and you've assumed that this virus started March 1st in the U.S., it'll be around April 15th that it'll peak, and it'll be in June that it'll end, that we'll start to see 0 cases sometime in June. 0 new daily deaths, I should say. But, okay, extend that to the end of April, or make it even better, early April, who knows? At some point, it will peak. By the way, very important to realize, they always say flattening the curve. They don't say reducing deaths. When you have a big curve, you have all the deaths right away, and then it's over. But the worry was that would overwhelm the healthcare system, and I agree with that. So they said, let's spread out the deaths through social distancing so that it doesn't... The only reason for the quarantining is to not overwhelm the healthcare system. It's not to reduce the overall number of deaths. We need to keep that in mind. It's called flattening the curve. It's not called ending the curve. And so what you have to realize with that is that there's 2 ways that flattening the curve works. One is if the number of deaths go down every day so it doesn't overwhelm the healthcare system. The other way that it works is if you expand the healthcare system. For instance, if you use all these cruise ships to set up these on-the-fly hospitals the way China built on-the-fly hospitals, which, by the way, they've all closed them down now. So that's one way to help the healthcare system. If it's truly the case that millions of masks, and by the way, companies are starting to 3D print masks now, So that's a huge innovation that's happening. So millions of masks will be 3D printed and delivered to the healthcare system. There's talk of 3D printing ventilators. I talked with Peter Diamandis right here on IG Live about that the other day. There's many companies donating their factories and equipment to provide more ventilators, to provide more equipment, to provide more masks. So once the healthcare system is over its own hump, you don't need to flatten the curve anymore. So the second that happens, and whether it's true or not, we'll find out. But the press conference the other day was suggesting that this week we'll start to see millions of new devices, masks, hospitals, and so on hit the healthcare system. You don't need to flatten the curve anymore after that. What you do then is you reopen businesses, you reopen the economy as quickly as possible. So all the layoffs, people can get back to work before they're fully out of a job. You could save millions and millions of jobs and potentially even millions of, and I'll be dramatic now, it could potentially save millions of jobs. If the economy has a worst case scenario, you're going to lose millions of lives in the long run from it. And that's just as scary, if not more scary, than the worst case scenario for coronavirus. So here's what's going to happen this week. Stimulus is going to get passed. We're going to continue to see worse data about coronavirus, although hopefully we're going to see better data in Italy, which is 10 days ahead of us. We're going to start to see the healthcare system get helped by private industry with all these millions of new masks, with millions of drugs, with all these new trials, with all these experimental vaccines, with cruise ships turning into hospitals, with all these new ventilators. You're going to see some help to the healthcare system. And then what you're going to finally see either at the end of this week or sometime next week, and this is just a guess, I hope I'm right, I could be wrong, but this would be the smart move for the economy, is you're going to need to at least partially reopen the economy. And what does it partially mean? You're going to have to quarantine, and I'll tell you the letter that I sent to, I won't say who I sent it to because who knows, maybe it'll have an effect, but I sent a letter to a very high up official in the government, and I basically suggested once the hospital system is buffered and once there's no longer a need to flatten the curve and once the stimulus is passed, you do need to restart the economy. So here's what I suggested in a letter to the government. Quarantine people who are positive, who positively test, plus their family, plus close contacts, plus people who have symptoms. Quarantine the elderly until the virus is at least 6 weeks past its peak. Continue to test aggressively. And by the way, we're going to go from hundreds of thousands of tests to millions of tests. And I recommend, as long as the evidence still continues to support this, give chloroquine to everyone with symptoms and everyone testing positive. Obviously, do that with each person with a doctor. I'm not suggesting people take it on their own. And then reopen every business. And not only that, I don't just suggest reopen every business. If they reopen every business, it's unclear if you and I are going to go out to the restaurant day one. So give a 1 month time frame or a 2 month time frame where if I save every receipt from I use in a restaurant, I can write that off on my taxes. So give some incentive for people to go out and start going to restaurants again. By the way, don't have restaurants have 100% capacity, maybe put them 50% capacity so there's still some distance between tables, but of course it's not going to help a lot. Just like social distancing in general, there's no proof that any social distancing works. It might just be the case in Italy, South Korea, Japan, China, and so on, that the pandemic just naturally has its peak and then goes down after 3 or 4 months. We don't know. So the only thing we really know is wash your hands and don't touch your face. And hopefully I wash my hands enough because I just love touching my face. I'm addicted to touching my face. It's like my favorite activity is just to touch my face. So I have to wash my hands a lot. But in the stimulus, someone's asking about the digital dollar. In the stimulus package that I last saw, there's a mention of a digital dollar. But I think that just means not Bitcoin, but it means have a way for the federal government to digitally send money to people who need it, rather than sending a check. I think that's a more efficient way, and I hope they do something like that. And that could lead to some kind of Bitcoin. But look, here's the thing. I do love Bitcoin, obviously, and I do think we do need some decentralized global currency. But because we do have centralized currency still, we're able to have a massive federal stimulus that's centrally controlled. And I think that helped in 2009, and certainly that's going to help the world right now. 2009, there was probably about $3 trillion in stimulus. In this stimulus, it's going to be maybe up to $10 trillion. Do you know what that means? It means if we pass this stimulus package, we're going to, first off, next quarter, we're going to see the worst data that we've seen since the Great Depression. It's going to look like another depression. But there's a huge difference between now and the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, they did the opposite of stimulus. They didn't really understand what stimulus was. Now we're doing super stimulus, stimulus on steroids. This economy is going to zoom August, September, October, November, December, and then all through 2021. You can't even imagine. The economy might even double from here. You can't even imagine how much this is going to help the economy. It's actually kind of scary. It's probably going to help the economy too much, so we have to be aware of inflation. But here's the good news. So someone's asking, if I feel this, why wouldn't I invest in the stock market right now? A week and a half ago, people were asking me, should I invest in the stock market? And I said no. And that was right after there was a 10% up day. It looked like things were going to go great. But the reality is, for me, I don't like to invest when everybody is panicking. I don't like a 10% up day, and I don't like a 10% down day. I don't like a 5% up day. I don't like a 5% down day. I don't like volatility. The world economy does not change 10% in one day. That's kind of insane action. So I wait. Just because you wait for things to be calm, it doesn't mean you might miss the bottom, but I don't care. This economy might, the Dow is going to double from here if this stimulus happens. And if we open businesses in time, if we open within the next week, the Dow Jones is going to double from here. There's so many opportunities in this market. It doesn't matter if you get them today or you get them a month from now or even 2 months from now. There's just opportunities. For instance, cannabis stocks, I don't own a single cannabis stock, right? But cannabis stocks have fallen to their worst levels ever. They're like penny stocks now. So I called a few CEOs of cannabis companies and I said, hey, how's business? And they're like, James, it's through the goddamn roof. Everyone's hoarding, getting as much cannabis as possible to kind of survive the anxiety of this situation. Our business is booming. And so what they're saying about their business is not the same as what's happening to their stocks. So I know for a fact there's going to be nonstop opportunities forever. Right now, I would look for the safest opportunities, like look for big, giant oil companies that pay dividends. Okay, this is not a recommendation, but here's one stock that's important to look at. Look at RVT, Roger Value Tom, or Roger Victor Tom, RVT, Royce Value Trust. So this is a stock, and all they do is they buy other stocks. But this stock trades for a value less than if you add up all of the values of the stocks that they own. They traded at about a 20% discount to all of the prices of the stocks that they own. And they have a 14% dividend. So if you want to buy the market, buy a stock like this that's the market plus a 20% discount, and it also has a 15% dividend. It's amazing. So again, that's not a recommendation. I'm not buying it today, but I might buy it a month from now as I see things stabilize. So any other questions? They always give me a 60-minute limit on these IG lives. So yes, RVT. They always give me a 60-minute limit on these IG lives. So I've got a few minutes left. Any other questions? I'll wait for some questions. Oh, I want to suggest also, I know people are sitting in their houses. Many people are isolated. So starting tomorrow on Instagram, every month I'm going to do a book giveaway. I'm going to take 6 books that I've been reading that month, 6 or 7 books that I've been reading that month, and I'm going to just simply give them away to a bunch of people who list their favorite books in the comments. So again, check out my Instagram account tomorrow. And there's no strings attached. I'm giving these books out for free. It'll be about like 5 or 6 people I'll give them to. I'll do like a random lottery. But I'm going to give away Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I'm going to give away Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed, one of my favorite writers. Of course, I'm going to give away Choose Yourself, which is more important than ever as people reinvent themselves coming out of this. I'm going to give away The War of Art by my good friend Stephen Pressfield about creativity. I'm going to give away Mastery by Robert Greene. I'm going to give away Maybe You Should Talk to Someone by Lori Gottlieb about her experiences in therapy, and she's a therapist. I'm going to give away Food by Jim Gaffigan. So I'm going to give away those books, and it's going to be on my Instagram account tomorrow, the instructions of how I'm going to give it away, but there's no strings attached. I'm just going to give it away for free to a bunch of people. I've also been responding to when companies I know or situations I'm familiar with, when the employees are laid off. I've been spreading the word about any GoFundMe that's set up for those employees. So if you work for a company where I could somehow verify, usually these are personal contacts, so I know the situations. But if you work for a company where I can verify that the people are employed and the employees are having a hard time now because they think they're laid off, I'm happy to share your GoFundMe, maybe even donate it on my page and in these Instagrams. So go to my Facebook page and you'll see there's a GoFundMe for Caroline's Comedy Club, an excellent comedy club where the employees have been laid off. There's also, if you go to ilostmygig.com, it's all the people who lost their gigs in South by Southwest. Let's not have, just because there's government stimulus, don't stand there waiting for your handout for a check. This is really the opportunity for people who have to help people who are scared and who are suffering. And this is a way we bridge that gap so people stop being angry and we close that income gap, we close that prosperity gap. This is an opportunity where we as a society can act more like a single community. Again, this is the first time in history that the entire human race, in 250,000 years that we've been a species, this is the first time ever we've all been united around one single goal. You, me, everybody else, we're surviving this one way or the other. And it's a shame, and I hope I survive it. I hope I don't get it. I hope I don't get sick and die. Doesn't change any of my opinions if I do, and I think that's an important qualification for having a reasonable opinion. But no matter what, we've been through something that nobody else in the entire human species has been through. And this is an opportunity to show that we're the hero of our story. Everyone has their own unique individual story. You can either be a hero, a bystander, or a victim. And this is the opportunity for us to all be the hero in this amazing story. Like, we want to be able to tell our grandchildren what we did during this time. And just like people from World War II, they're proud of helping serve their country and helping people. But this, believe it or not, this is even bigger than World War II because this affects the entire planet in a way that World War II didn't. And World War II was one side versus the other. This is everybody working together for a common cause. And that common cause is not just coronavirus, it's also sustaining and continuing to grow the economy, because that's where we get all of our science, that's where we get all of our innovation. Don't forget, all of these cures that are coming out are coming from drug companies. All of these ventilators are coming from the factories of real companies. How are you getting your food now? How are you getting your toilet paper? I'm using Amazon, which is a company. It's not the government. So this is a time when we as a community can help other members of the community. And yes, there's going to be federal stimulus to help as well, but don't just depend on that. Focus on what we can do as individuals and as a community, because that will mean that we know how to survive these situations. And now, again, just to summarize, if I have 1 minute left, 1 minute, 38 seconds remaining, there's many reasons to believe a best case scenario will happen. And I still kind of think mid-April, there will be a peak, meaning the number of deaths per day will start to go down. We're already starting, hopefully seeing that in Italy, but we did see it in China. We did see it in South Korea. We did see it in Singapore. We've seen it in other countries. The other thing is, I do think the stimulus package is going to be passed probably today. It'll be bipartisan, which is exciting. I think the economic data is going to be horrible next quarter, but then the quarter after that, the stimulus will kick in. The economy will be huge. But most importantly, because of all the equipment that supposedly the healthcare system is getting this week, there's no more reason to flatten the curve. The only reason to flatten the curve is to buffer the healthcare system. Well, we did it. If they do get that equipment this week, then we succeeded in the flattened curve, succeeded. It doesn't mean less deaths. It means the healthcare system doesn't get overwhelmed. And then we should immediately open up businesses. In fact, we're going to have to immediately reopen businesses. Anyone who says differently doesn't understand the kind of pain and suffering that will result worldwide if we don't. So I do predict that's what's going to happen. And you're going to see amazing opportunities in the stock market. There's going to be amazing entrepreneurial opportunities, which we'll discuss at a later point. But keep safe. Good luck. Stop by tomorrow. I'm going to do the book giveaway on my Instagram. I'm just going to give out books for free. Stop by then. And I'll also do this IG Live at 2 p.m. tomorrow. Thanks so much. See you at